Today we'll be talking about the inguinal canal. The inguinal canal is present in the inguinal region. The inguinal region is also called the groin. So the inguinal region is basically the junction of the anterior abdominal wall and the anterior aspect of the thigh. It extends between the anterior superior iliac spine and the pubic tubercle. Before going to the inguinal canal, we need to talk about the inguinal ligament. The inguinal ligament is a thick fibrous band extending from the anterior superior iliac spine to the pubic tubercle. So it's a fibrous band. It extends from the anterior superior iliac spine to the pubic tubercle. This right here is the inguinal ligament. As we can see here, the inguinal ligament is formed by the lower part of the external oblique aponeurosis. This is the external oblique muscular part and this is the aponeurotic part. So the lower part of the aponeurotic part forms the inguinal ligament and this is folded and thickened backward on itself. So the lower part of the ligament is rounded, as you can see here. The upper part is grooved. The deep fascia of the thigh, which is the fascia lata, it's attached to the lower part of the entire length of the ligament and it makes it convex inferiorly by its pull. So the inguinal ligament here, this is the inguinal ligament, and the inguinal ligament has various expansions. The first one is called the lacunar ligament. The lacunar ligament is also called the Gibernat's ligament. So from the medial end, the deep fibers of the inguinal ligament, they curve horizontally backward to the medial part of the pecten pubis. See, this is the lacunar ligament. So from the medial end, the deep fibers, so this is the medial end. From the medial end, the deep fibers, they curve horizontally backward to the medial part of the pecten pubis, forming the lacunar ligament. So this is the pecten pubis. The ligament is triangular in shape, as we can see here. The apex is attached to the pubic tubercle. This is the apex where the two crura meet. So this is the apex, and its sharp lateral edge forms the medial border of the femoral canal. The femoral canal is a site for the femoral hernia. Next, coming to the pectineal ligament. So the pectineal ligament, which is here, so it is basically an extension of the lacunar ligament. So the pectineal ligament, which we can see here, is an extension of the lacunar ligament and it goes up to the iliopectineal eminence. So from the lacunar ligament to the iliopectineal eminence, from here to here, that is the pectineal ligament. The pectineal ligament is also called ligament of Cooper. Coming to the reflected part of the inguinal ligament, so the superficial fibers from the medial end of the inguinal ligament. This is the lateral end and this is the medial end of the inguinal ligament. From the medial end, the fibers, they expand upward and medially to form this ligament. It lies behind the superficial inguinal ring. The superficial inguinal ring and in front of the conjoint tendon. This right here is the conjoint tendon. And this is a superficial inguinal ring. So this reflected part of the inguinal ligament lies behind the superficial inguinal ring and in front of the conjoint tendon that I showed you in the previous photo. These fibers interlace with those of the counterpart of the opposite side of the linea alba. Now here what we are seeing is the linea alba. So we can see that it's converging towards the linea alba. Then the last ligament of the last extension of the inguinal ligament is the ilioinguinal ligament. The ilioinguinal ligament is what we can see here. So it's very simple. It's a fibrous band extending from the inferior aspect. This is the inferior aspect of the inguinal ligament to the iliopectineal eminence. So this is the iliopectineal eminence. So once again revising, the inguinal ligament, it extends from the anterior superior iliac spine to the pubic tubercle. And it's basically formed by the lower fibers of the external oblique aponeurosis. It has two parts. One is the groove, which is on the upper side, and on the lower part it is a rounded structure, and the fascia lata is attached to the lower part. The extensions are, there are four: lacunar ligament, which is the Gibnart's ligament, the pectineal ligament, which is ligament of Cooper, that is the extension of the lacunar ligament. Then we have the ilioinguinal ligament, which connects the inferior surface inguinal ligament and the iliopubic eminence. Then we have the reflected part of the inguinal ligament, which converges onto the linea alba, and it starts from the medial aspect of the inguinal ligament. So in this diagram, this is just an overview of the inguinal region. So basically, after you take the skin, fascia and all, you'll get the external abdominal oblique muscle. After that, coming to the more medial side, you'll get your aponeurosis, that is external abdominal aponeurosis. When you reflect the external abdominal aponeurosis, beneath that, you get the internal abdominal muscle. So this is the internal abdominal muscle. And again, when you reflect the internal abdominal muscle, you will get the transverse abdominis muscle, which you can see here. Then the other important structures of the inguinal region are the deep inguinal ring. And the deep inguinal ring is present 1.2 centimeters above the mid-inguinal point. So from its margin, the fascia transversalis is prolonged into the canal like a sleeve, and this forms the internal spermatic fascia. That was a deep inguinal ring. Next, we have our superficial inguinal ring here. The superficial inguinal ring, it's a triangular gap, and it is formed by the aponeurosis of the external oblique muscle. In this diagram, we can see that the superficial inguinal ring is a hole inside the external oblique aponeurosis. So here we can see that the superficial inguinal ring, the pubic crest, it lies above and lateral to the pubic crest. So this is a pubic crest, so it lies above and lateral to the pubic crest. The pubic crest forms the base of the triangle. So this is the base of the triangle, which is the pubic crest. And the upper medial and lower lateral margins of the triangle, these are called crura. So the two crura, they are united to form the intercrural fibers. So this is the lateral crura, and this is the medial crura, and this is the pubic crest. So this forms a triangular opening, that is the superficial inguinal ring. This ring is 2.5 centimeters long and 1.2 centimeters broad. So now coming to our main topic, that is the inguinal canal. It's an oblique intermuscular passage about 4 centimeters long, lying above the medial half of the inguinal ligament. So inguinal canal can be discussed under the following headings. The first heading being the extent and the direction. Then we can discuss about the inguinal rings, that has already been discussed, the deep inguinal ring and the superficial inguinal ring. The structures passing through the deep and the superficial inguinal ring. The boundaries of the inguinal canal, its contents, and in its contents we can talk about the spermatic cord and its contents. Then we have to talk about the mechanisms to maintain the integrity of the inguinal canal. And lastly, the inguinal triangle, which is also called as the Hesselbach's triangle. And with that, for the clinical anatomy, we need to talk about the inguinal hernias. The inguinal canal extends from the deep inguinal ring to the superficial inguinal ring. It's a 4 centimeter intermuscular passage. So we've already talked about the deep inguinal ring and the superficial inguinal ring. Now coming to the boundaries of the inguinal canal. So coming to the boundary. So we have an anterior surface, a roof, posterior surface, and the floor. So now we'll be taking a look at it in the dissected way. So firstly, from here to here, we have an inguinal ligament. So that is where the inguinal canal is situated. After that, coming to the anterior wall. So the anterior wall is formed by the external oblique aponeurosis muscles, the origin of the external oblique aponeurosis. Before this, we have the skin, superficial fascia, and then we have the external oblique aponeurosis. And beneath that, when this is reflected, now this layer is reflected and we get the internal oblique muscle. So that one right there is the internal oblique muscle. Now the internal oblique muscle is reflected, and we can see that now the internal oblique muscle is reflected, and see, this is the internal oblique muscle that we had. So it's reflected, and the internal oblique muscle along with the transversus abdominis, these two form the roof. So the arch fibers of the internal oblique and the transversus abdominis forms the roof. So now after the internal oblique is reflected and then the transversus abdominis is reflected, below that we have the fascia transversalis. Now the posterior wall is mainly formed by the fascia transversalis Along with the fascia transversalis, which is the yellow part, we have the conjoint tendon also. I've shown you the conjoint tendon in a diagrammatic view. So this is the conjoint tendon. And the conjoint tendon is formed by the aponeurosis of the internal oblique along with the transverse abdominis muscle. And in the medial 1/3, the posterior wall is formed by the reflected part of the inguinal ligament, which is shown here. So basically the posterior wall, one was formed by the fascia transversalis, the conjoint tendon, and the medial 1/3 is formed by the reflected part of the inguinal ligament. And lastly, the floor which is here, this is formed by the inguinal ligament. So the content of the inguinal canal is, in the male, it's a spermatic cord. Here you can see the spermatic cord. So in males, the contents are the spermatic cord and the ilioinguinal ring, and in the females, it is the round ligament of uterus and the ilioinguinal ring. But although the inguinal nerve is a content of the inguinal canal, it does not enter the canal through the deep inguinal ring. It enters the canal from side through a slit between the external and internal oblique muscle. It lies in front of the cord and passes out of the canal through the superficial inguinal ring to supply the inguinal region. Now, talking about the spermatic cord, in this diagram you can just have a view of how the spermatic cord is. So it's actually covered by the continuation of the fascia transversalis, which continues as the internal spermatic fascia. So coming to the spermatic cord, we have three layers. One is the internal spermatic fascia, cremasteric fascia, and the external spermatic fascia. On the upper side of the spermatic cord, we have the testicular artery. Around the testicular artery, we find papinephorm plexus of the testicular artery. We have sympathetic nerves. Coming to the middle part, there's remains of processus vaginalis, and then we have the ductus deferens, the papinephorm plexus surrounding the ductus deferens, and we have the genital branch of the genitofemoral nerve. On the outer aspect of the spermatic cord, we'll have the ilioinguinal nerve, and between the cremasteric fascia and the internal spermatic fascia, we'll have the cremasteric nerves and vessels. In this, the external spermatic fascia is derived from the aponeurosis of the external oblique muscle. The cremasteric fascia is derived from the internal oblique muscle. So, coming to the mechanisms of the maintaining the integrity of the inguinal canal, first is the flap valve mechanism. So the canal is oblique, so its deep and superficial inguinal rings, they do not lie opposite to each other. So as a result, when there's an increase in the intra-abdominal pressure, the anterior and posterior walls of the canal, they are approximated like a valve. In this diagram here, you can see a clear diagram of the flap valve mechanism. Coming to the slit valve mechanism, the contraction of the external oblique muscle approximates the two crura, medial and lateral of superficial inguinal ring, like a slit valve. The intracrural fibers also help in this act. Here you can see that the lateral and medial crus, they are approximated. So that is the slit valve mechanism. Now coming to the ball valve mechanism. So the contraction of the cremasteric muscle pulls the testis up and superficial inguinal ring is plugged by the spermatic cord, which is clearly seen in this diagram. Then guarding of the inguinal ring. So basically the deep inguinal ring is guarded anteriorly by the internal oblique muscle, and superficial inguinal ring is guarded by the conjoint tendon and the reflected part of the inguinal ligament. Here it's clearly seen that the deep inguinal ring, it is guarded by the internal oblique, and the superficial inguinal ring by the conjoint tendon and the reflected part of the inguinal ligament. This is the interfoveolar ligament. This also helps to maintain the integrity of the inguinal canal by strengthening the fascia transversalis. The muscle fibers, they arch down from the lower border of the transverse abdominis, as seen here. This is the transverse abdominis, and they are arching downwards from the transverse abdominis to the superior ramus of pubis, and this is the interfoveolar ligament. Now coming to the inguinal triangle, which is also called as Hesselbach's triangle. The inguinal triangle is situated deep to the posterior wall of the inguinal canal. Hence, it is seen on the inner aspect of the lower part of the anterior abdominal wall. The boundaries of the inguinal triangle are, so it is formed on the lower 5 cm of the lateral border of the rectus abdominis muscle. That is a medial border. Coming to the lateral border, it is formed by the inferior epigastric artery. The inferior epigastric artery is a continuation of the external iliac artery. Inferiorly, it's formed by the medial half of the inguinal ligament. The floor of the triangle is formed by peritoneum, extraperitoneal tissue, and fascia transversalis. The medial umbilical ligament crosses the triangle, divides it into a medial and lateral part. The lateral part is more prone to inguinal hernia because on the medial part there is the conjoint tendon that supports it. So the inguinal hernia, they are more prone to occur on the lateral side of the Hasselbalch's triangle. Now showing a more clearer look. So here we can see that this is the rectus abdominis muscle. So this will be our Hasselbalch's triangle. Here this is the rectus abdominis, or the lateral part of rectus abdominis, lower 5 cm. This will be the lateral part of the inguinal ligament. And this is the inferior epigastric vein, which is a branch of the external iliac artery.